Hello, and welcome to the Locals Guide Community Building Podcast. My guest today is Karina Mendoza-Wittke, interpreter and translator. Welcome, Karina.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to take the opportunity today to learn more about your professional background as an interpreter and translator. And I'd first like to start off by learning about what languages you speak and how you acquired the languages.
Well, the first language I learned was, I was exposed to Spanish because I was born in Mexico. But I was at a very young age, I moved to Germany. So my first language is German. And after learning German, we went back to Mexico and I relearned Spanish, but I learned Spanish and English at the same time because my father decided to put me in the American school in Mexico, where all my classes were in English, and then everybody around me spoke Spanish. So I learned English and Spanish at the same time.
And do you feel like your German, Spanish, and English are all about the same skill level, or do you find that you have preference or strengths in one or the other?
I think it depends, because I read one time that experiences you have in a language, you tend to communicate them in the language that you had the experience in. So I think I am the same at this point in all three languages. However, when I speak to my mother in German about like personal life or emotional things, that's where my German comes out. And when I'm speaking about business and things like that, that's where my Spanish and my English comes out. And I learned French afterwards in Mexico as well. I did the Alliance Française. But coming to the United States, French has been a language that I haven't used very much. So I think I am very shy in French.
So I also speak Spanish, English, and French, and have worked as an interpreter and translator. So I can connect with some of those feelings, but I learned them much later. I learned them as a teenager and then as a young adult. But I want to know also, like what are you using professionally more now? Are you mainly doing English, Spanish, or are you also using your German?
I do mainly English and Spanish. I've had one occasion in federal court where the judge asked me to be there for a hearing for some witnesses testifying out of Germany. And it was a hate convention case. And I tried to recuse myself because, as you know, there's a language and there's the judicial vocabulary of the language that I was never exposed to in German. So I do not speak judicial German. And I let the judge know, and he did not allow me to recuse myself. And he just said, "You're it." And what a judge says goes.
And before we continue talking about interpreter and translator roles, will you give a brief explanation to our audience the difference between an interpreter and a translator? Because I know that I hear people often misuse the words. And so
Yes, absolutely. An interpreter is a person that switches languages or code switches between German or between the source language and the target language in a spoken manner. And interpreting actually has three different modes. It has a simultaneous mode, it has a consecutive mode, and it has a sight translation mode. So the first is the simultaneous, where basically you're speaking into somebody's ear, be it via like shushu talk or with a equipment, for instance, or like most of my work is judicial, so it would be during a trial, you interpret what everybody else says to um, the person. And then the consecutive is when one person says a whole paragraph and then you interpret the whole paragraph. And then, so that applies more to like a witness stand testimony and things like that. And then the side translation is part of interpreting, is where you take a document that is, let's say, in Spanish, and as you read it, you are reading it out loud into the different language. And the and a translator, in contrast, is a person that where you everything is written. So there's no spoken. The person is in their own little office, and everything is just from the source text to the target text. It's all written down.
Great. That's
Like,
excellent.
or something like that.
That's excellent explanation, and thank you for giving the different modes of interpreting as well. So I know in the experience that I have, I've done simultaneous and a consecutive, and they each have their different challenges. Which do you find more challenging?
Actually, to me, it depends. It kind of depends on what mood you're in. But I find them the same. But I wanted to add just a little section where the difference between an interpreter and a translator and a bilingual person, because that sometimes also has its is misunderstandings where people believe that because you are bilingual, oh, they can use that person as an interpreter. And the example I always like to bring is a piano player. So a piano player that plays concerts, they have to have their fingers in order to play the piano. However, not just because you have fingers do you play the piano. So
Right.
an interpreter has to be bilingual, and not just like conversational bilingual, but at a higher level education level bilingual, in order to be an interpreter. But not all bilinguals can be interpreters, because that is a whole different part of the brain that has to be developed like a muscle. You have to work at it, you have to train your brain. It's a whole I mean, you can spend years developing it, and some people, their brain just does not split in that way, and they can't do it.
That's a great point to bring up, because I know often I interpreted in the medical field, and I know also in the educational field, often kids can be brought in as interpreters in situations where or families, if they don't speak English, will rely on their children, and sometimes children are put under pressure at a young age to be interpreters when there are certain skills that are required.
Yeah.
So did you ever do much interpreting when you were younger?
Not at
by
all.
necessity?
Not at all. I had both my parents were multilingual. My mom is German, and she speaks German and Spanish and English and French. And my father was Mexican, but he spoke Spanish and German and Swedish and English and French. So nobody around me ever needed interpreter services.
Did you go to formal training, or did you go through a certification process in Oregon, or how did you come about becoming an interpreter and a translator? Specifically, I know you've mentioned in the courtroom in a judicial setting. So how did that come about?
Well, it was when both my children were, I was a stay-at-home mom because I'm also a jewelry maker and artisan. And I was providing and supporting my family with my art. And when both my children were in school, I actually decided I want to do something different
Mhm.
as an add-on to my work, and I explored, and I thought I would be or become a language teacher. And I looked around and I kind of followed the flow of the universe, someone could say, and certain doors that I wanted to open didn't. And then one of my jewelry customers came and said, you should try to be a court interpreter. And I had never even thought about it or seen one or been exposed to it at all. And I went to court and I observed and I said, that could work. And I did I took a like an orientation course, and I said, this was good. But at that time, Oregon didn't offer the certification because Oregon had budgetary issues.
Mhm.
So I went to Nevada and I said, I'm going to just take the test that it takes to get certified and see what it entails, then study on my own or study with a work group and take it again.
Mhm.
And I formed a study group and we practiced together and helped each other out. And then I went to Nevada and took the test and passed it. So then I was certified.
That's great.
So that happened. And then I started working and I've been doing that ever since 2003 is when I got certified. So I've been at it now 20 years.
And I also know that from my own experience, when I went through a certification process in North Carolina, um, I was taught how you mirror the language of the person speaking. So if someone is speaking saying I, then you also say I. Can you explain a little bit more about that? How the technique of interpreting and how that what the rules are for you around interpreting in judicial process?
Well, it is interesting because yes, the training for interpreters is that when you refer to yourself and the I, um, when the interpreter speaks of herself, she is in the third person.
Mhm.
Because when you think about the courtroom, everything that is being said is recorded. So
Mhm.
we are, as an interpreter, you are the other person's or the non-English speaker's voice. And when
Mhm.
it's recorded, everything the person says, you say the same. It's I, always in the first person,
Mhm.
you are the other person's voice. But interestingly enough, it's not just the pronoun that you use, but also we have to include, or we're trained to include feeling and
Mhm.
intonation and things like that, because there's a lot of information contained in the tone. And the perfect example I always give is in the judicial setting. If a person, let's say, gets asked the question, did you commit this crime? Or did you kill your wife? Let's say for dramatic effect.
Yeah.
And the person can say, no, or no.
Mhm.
It is the exact same word, but the body language and the tone carries a world of information that actually is almost the opposite of what they said. So you, so we have to, when we interpret, we have to include that tone of irreverence or the tone of fear or anxiety, and because that is all part of the message.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because I know that that is such an important part of being an interpreter of not only mirroring the person like I, but then the emotion, the tone, the feeling, and I think especially for a courtroom where you are really you're really mirroring the person in the best way possible. Do you find that it's a process that you move into easily with the emotional side, or was that something you had to get used to as you grew into your profession?
I found it easy, um, because it's both easy and difficult because I'm a natural empathic person. So it's very easy for me to be next to the person and almost get into like an automatic mode where you almost absorb the person
Mhm.
and just and their tone and try to represent that person or be that person in their way of speaking. And that came very easy to me. And what makes that difficult is that we also have to work very hard to emotionally be detached because first and foremost we are neutral parties to whatever proceeding is happening, because the same way I mirror the person that is a non-English speaker, I also mirror, let's say, the attorney or the person that is speaking English and I have to interpret into Spanish. And with that comes, I don't know, sometimes it is somebody that's pressuring somebody or being manipulative or just forceful or super nice to entice information or something. So I have to mimic that as well. And then going from role to role is sometimes hard, but it's also beautiful because it's almost like a dance. Because you go and then you come and then you go and then you come, and it's interesting that way. But then that makes it hard because you do absorb very difficult content.
Yes.
That is, we're as interpreters, we're very exposed to vicarious trauma.
Yes, I agree. I know that you are mentioning the courtroom, and I know that there are very, um, you know, there are judgments that are being made in that room for people's lives. And my experience is in the medical profession where it's different. Do you also have experience in the medical profession as an interpreter?
I do,
Mhm.
and most of the work I did for a couple years before I got certified through the courts is was medical. So I was there as an interpreter for the birthing of a baby, which is beautiful, and I was there for emergency situations, which have their own vicarious trauma load. Um, and it is a little more relaxed, but you're still a neutral party, and uh, you do interpret without adding and without omitting and without lowering or heightening the register of what is being said.
And besides the courtroom and this previous experience with medical interpreting, are there any other settings in which you function as an interpreter or a translator?
I have I have done a lot of work in the education setting. I've done conference interpreting quite a bit as well. And then years ago, I was hired by the Education Service District to develop a program for training, for identifying and training their staff to work as interpreters. And
Oh,
that included teaching technique and teaching the ethics, which the ethics are very strict for interpreting. There's a very strict code of ethics that we follow. And there was also it was a beautiful, the very first class for everybody was also on how to use interpreters correctly, because that um, interpreters as a tool, um, the better you know how to use a tool, the better results you're going to get. So I did
I
that. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was going to say another part that I remember from my training was actually not only the tone and the person and the emotion, but also where you sit or stand in
Yes.
relation to the people that you are interpreting for. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Well, yes, as an interpreter, your positioning is important because um, you are there as people's voices, and you want to be as unobtrusive as possible. So you want to be not the center of attention, and positioning will determine that. And if there's a doctor speaking to his patient or an attorney speaking to his client, if you're in the middle or if you sit as a triangle, like if you, depending on where you position yourself, you want to avoid taking away from the connection that people can have to each other. And
Mhm.
especially when you're dealing with people that don't speak English and are in this country, they see you as somebody that speaks their language and they want to immediately have a connection to you. But
Mhm.
as we are interpreters and we are completely neutral parties, we cannot become advocates, for instance, for a person. So we really do not form attachments to people. And by positioning ourselves in a way that we're less in the picture, it allows the connection easier, more easier to be happening between the two people that are actually speaking to each other.
Right. And that's what I remember as far as the triangle position, at least in a medical setting where you're not perceived as being on one side versus the other.
Hmm.
Where so I imagine that that's very similar in the courtroom, although um, are if someone is testifying, are you also how do you position yourself in the courtroom?
Well, when somebody's testifying, usually there's the judge and then there's the witness and the jury. It depends. The courtrooms are usually different, but the jury tends to be on one side. And then, so you position yourself, I position myself a little behind the person so that the jury has a clear view of the person, because I
Mm,
don't want the jury to look at me. I want the jury to look at the witness.
mm,
And this is when, if the defendant is or one of the witnesses is non-English speaking. But if somebody else is testifying and I'm doing the simultaneous interpreting, I'm usually sitting either somewhere completely different and we're working with equipment that's all
mhm.
simultaneous, or if it's a shorter session and we don't have equipment, then I'm positioned behind the person, kind of whispering to the person's ear.
Mm, and that just brings up that great point when you were talking about training people to work with interpreters, because I know often people will make the mistake of talking to the interpreter with the eye contact at the interpreter
Yes,
when it really should be, like you said, that the interpreter does not exist. Um,
exactly.
yeah.
And part of being an interpreter is you're very flexible and you try to respond and correct those kind of situations. Like if I'm in that situation and the person doesn't know how to use an interpreter and is focusing on the interpreter and saying, please tell him this and tell him that, then I will sometimes reposition myself and actually go slightly behind the person I'm interpreting for,
Uh,
and then briefly switch to the simultaneous into the person's ear, so that, and I will let the person know, just please, you can direct to the person, speak to the person directly, and then and then kind of jump into simultaneous, or do a kind of a hybrid, so that the that your actions can help the people do the right thing.
mm,
Hmm.
that's great. That's a
Yeah.
good way to have a technique while you're in the process to
Yes.
remedy. So tell me a little bit more too. I know just how the vocabulary is so specific to certain areas, and your process in becoming a court interpreter. Did you have to really learn specific vocabulary, and how I just like to hear a little bit more what you mentioned previously about just because if you're bilingual doesn't necessarily mean that you have the vocabulary for what you need to interpret for.
Mhm. It started with a lot of observation. I would go to court and observe and try to interpret in my head real time so that I could say, okay, well, that word gets stuck, and oh, I don't know that word. So basically, I had to learn all the legal process, all the what things mean. So it was a lot of learning about the law and different kind of motions and what things actually meant deeply. And luckily, I we formed a group between three different people here in Southern Oregon, one from Klamath Falls and another person from Ashland. And we would get together in a restaurant and just come up with vocabulary and practice vocabulary and help each other out. And because for some, there's not just the legal vocabulary. A lot of times you get very specific vocabulary that you're not used to, or like sexually explicit vocabulary or swear words. And you have to be comfortable using all language
Mm,
because whatever comes up, you have to be able to do it. So I remember even moments where we would sit together in our study group in like a public restaurant, and we're trying to just say things that are not your nature to say, either foul language or,
mm,
you know, sexually explicit things that come up in court. And, there were quite some heads turning because we would just say things out loud, and it was pretty funny. But no, you just practice. And if you're lucky enough to have someone else to practice, that's great fortune. Mhm.
And you had mentioned earlier just the emotional toll. Even though you are detaching emotionally, there's a lot of information that you are still taking in. Um, will you speak to that a little bit, and how your other role in life as a jewelry maker helps you with that?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, as we said, we are exposed to very difficult things, and having to interpret in the first person, um, as opposed to other people that are exposed to vicarious trauma, like doctors or attorneys or first responders that deal with the trauma, but it's always outside of them, and they still get affected. And as interpreters, we take it in. So, I remember there have been times where I come out of an appointment, and during the appointment, I am good and I'm efficient and I'm interpreting very difficult things, child abuse things, victim testimony to the grand jury, for instance. And, he hurt me this way or he hurt me that way. And it's all in the first person.
Mhm.
And in the moment, you're in work mode and you do it, but then you come out, and so I've gone to my car and just had, a good cry out because it's there.
Mm.
And that's where my jewelry making or my work as an artisan has been a very great support, because it allows me to be creative and have kind of an outlet in that way, and that kind of feeds your soul in a different way. And so you're putting something good in, and not just the vicarious trauma part.
Mm. That's great.
And that goes hand in hand with having, a good support at home and a good place where you can just unwind and let go of that. Mhm.
How how often are you interpreting in the courtroom, and are you looking for work outside of the courtroom, or what other kinds of interpreting are you doing these days?
I do mostly interpreting in the judicial system, because there is statewide and nationwide a great shortage of interpreters.
Mm,
So I do a lot of work for the Oregon Judicial Department. for the courts. I also do a lot of work for the public defenders and defense attorneys in general. I also work for federal attorneys and federal court. I also work for private attorneys that do probate or any other like personal injury lawyers, things like that. I do a lot of depositions. I do. I would like to do more. I do have some educational conference interpreting that I do that I enjoy a lot because it's a different subject matter, and I would like to have more of that kind of interpreting where it's not necessarily judicial. But at the moment, I have a lot of remote work also with metro areas in different states where where I work, but it's all still in the judicial setting because there's a lot of medical interpreters, but the difficulty in getting certified um, for the medical is hard because of all the terminology, but the level of that is required to get court certified is so high that there just isn't um,
Yeah.
interpreters available. So currently, that's the most of my work.
Mhm.
Oh, and translations. I do a lot of written translations.
Uh-huh.
And one of my favorite things that I do that is a specialty because most interpreters don't do this is I do what is called forensic transcription translation, where you
Oh,
take, say, an interview or like the the police body cam footage, and uh, and I transcribe it and then I translate it exactly the it has to be verbatim, like with all the things that we talked about. it, it's harder to put in writing than like when you speak it, and and it's very lengthy,
uh-huh.
but it, I like it because I like doing puzzles, and that is like working on a puzzle with all different languages and stuff, so I like that.
And is that usually in English that and then you're transcribing it or translating it into Spanish? Is that the direction that it usually goes?
Usually it goes with let's say they're doing an interview and the person they're interviewing is actually Spanish speaking. So it's usually Spanish into English because there's a
Okay.
rule that all evidence that's going to be presented in court has to be in English. So if
Okay.
anybody's going to present like a video or something, it has to be transcribed and translated into English. Or
Great.
it could be a conversation between two Spanish speakers, let's say, where they're talking about committing a crime or during the commission of a crime or whatever, things like that.
Okay. That makes
Mm,
sense.
mhm.
So are you currently looking for more interpreting or translating freelance opportunities?
Um, it, I aim to serve. Let's put it that way. So if somebody needs it, I will try to do my best to provide the service.
So here I have your email, spanish.interpreter@live.com. So if anyone is listening and needs specific help with language, then they can reach you. Is
Yeah.
there anything else you want to say about how you feel you are in service to people through this role, and what feels good about it? What do you enjoy about this role and the purpose that it gives you?
It actually it does give me a big sense of purpose, and that is a blessing. It's also a curse because I remember when I was just beginning, I went to court and to observe, and I watched another interpreter that came from out of town, and he interpreted, and I could hear what the person was saying, and sometimes not out of lack of skill, but sometimes because there's so much going on. A lot of what the non-English speaker was saying in her anxiety and the fear of losing her children, it didn't reach the judge because of the. And I mean, it was very at the beginning. I had no foot to stand on to, excuse me or interfere or anything. So I just watched it happen. And I watched this woman lose the custody of her children because what she said didn't get all the way to the judge. And that gave me a huge sense of responsibility of doing absolutely the best that I can, because unfortunately we are there, and we're part of justice of justice being served, because if you can't understand, you can participate in the proceeding. And also, we provide a service that people need during sometimes the most difficult times of their lives. And it's helpful to do a good job, and to know that you are making a difference, because otherwise people wouldn't have access to justice.
Thanks so much, Karina, for talking to me about this role. And I think that really what people sometimes don't know, if they know about the role of an interpreter translator, is just that huge responsibility and ethics that's involved. So thanks for speaking to that, and making us aware too of the large role and responsibility that you carry. And we appreciate your work.
Well, thank you. And it actually, I do it with great joy.
Great. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.